Good to see all of you tonight. It's been about 3 weeks since I've taught a Bible class, so I don't know whether I can do it or not, but I stepped away for a couple gospel meetings and appreciate Kent filling in for me. And then Sunday, because we had the power outage, I didn't teach a class that Sunday either, and so it's been a little while, but I'm glad that Kent was able to cover those classes those last couple of Wednesdays for me while I was away, and appreciate his efforts to do that. We're in Luke chapter 6, and we are going to pick up about verse 27 or so in this narrative. What is, it's on, Jim, I'm not sure what's happening with it. Yeah, sorry, it's on, so I'm not sure what's going on with it. Hey, Jim, or John, can you grab 2 AA batteries, and we'll just switch the batteries. Anyway, we'll cover here Luke chapter 27. We'll move through this. What are we dealing with right here in this particular chapter? In this moment? What do we call this normally? This section of Scripture? Okay, Beatitudes. What's the whole thing? There you go. That's what I'm. That's Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew's account, how long is it? Okay, longer. You just got, that was an easy answer. It's 3 chapters, right? In Matthew's a record of the Sermon on the Mount. It actually goes from Matthew chapter 5 through Matthew chapter 7 when you look at the Sermon on the Mount in that narrative. In this chapter, he deals with it on a much shorter, more abridged kind of approach. Luke doesn't give us everything that Matthew gives us as it relates to the Sermon on the Mount. If you read the sermon recorded in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, by the way, you could do that if you read even at a slow pace, probably in 15 or 20 minutes. Luke's record's even shorter, kind of a reminder to those of us that preach that you don't necessarily have to preach for 2 hours and 15 minutes to get your point across. Jesus gives us the most powerful sermon probably ever known to man, and very short order gives us a lot to think about and a lot to consider as it relates to those things. And so we pick up in that reading. Kent studied with you those Beatitudes or the blessings. Blessed are those who have these particular things. Then he talked about what right after that? The woes, right? He talks about the woes that came as it relates to that. And so it was, blessed are they who receive these things. Woe unto those who choose these paths. And then now, here in verse 27, he says, but I say unto you, is he just kind of giving them thoughts, short little sermonettes within the sermon, if you will. I say unto you which hear, sometimes you'll hear that phrase, Jesus will say, those who have ears to hear what? Let them hear, right? It's the same kind of sentiment here in verse 27. But he says, I say unto you which hear, love your enemies, do good to them which hate you, bless them that curse you, and pray for them which despitefully use you. Now, quick question. Does that follow human wisdom? No, it does not. It does not follow human wisdom, this idea of love your enemies. We're actually generally taught by culture to do the opposite. And rarely have you ever hear in societal conversation or human conversations about blessing those who curse you, pray for those who despitefully use you. In fact, we generally have the attitude often, I don't say we as in you personally, but people generally have the idea that you return fire with fire. But Jesus says, my citizens don't do that. You want to be a follower of Jesus, you're going to have to think differently. You're going to have to react differently. You're going to have to behave differently than what most human beings might do, say, or respond in similar kinds of circumstances. You may have an enemy that you want to seek vengeance on. You may have somebody who's been contrary towards you or created challenges and difficulties for you, and your instinct, if you will, or your desire might be to retaliate or to seek vengeance of some type or kind. But Jesus says, my citizens don't do that. Those who are citizens of the kingdom of Jesus, they act completely differently. In fact, they love their enemies. They do good to those who hate them. They bless them that curse them, and they pray for those who despitefully use them, to the point, verse 29, that even if somebody what? Strikes thee on the one cheek, offer also the other, and him that taketh away thy cloak forbid not to take thy coat also. Now, by the way, verse 29 isn't an isolated thought. It's a thought in relationship to all the things he's already said, these prior few verses. Note very quickly here, by the way, that Jesus does not say, stand there and let somebody knock the thunder out of you. That's not what he said. He didn't say that you have to stand there and be abused or beaten or knocked to and fro. That's not the point of what Jesus is saying here. The slap of the face is more of a what? It's an attitude. What else would we call that, though, if somebody slaps somebody in the face? It's an insult, right? They feel insulted, and so the retaliatory response is to slap somebody in the face, right? Do I dare say it? Will Smith was you don't even know who that is, never mind. He was insulted, and he slapped Chris Rock on the face because of it, right? So you get that imagery, right? When people are, it's an insult. It's a reactionary insult towards one. Somebody wants to insult you with a slap on the face. Don't strike back. Don't retaliate. That's not the way we behave. If just turn the other cheek and say, I've absorbed that one. If you want to continue to insult, then I know it's against the way we think, but it is the manner in which God and Jesus would want us to respond. Somebody takes from you your cloak, then if he wants here, take my coat as well. The point is, I think Jesus is trying to get us to see in all of these pictures, is the idea that his citizens don't seek their own vengeance. They don't strike back when others strike at them. They're not ready to fight just because somebody has insulted them or challenged them in some way. We respond completely differently as others would when they've been insulted, when they've been defrauded, when they've been harmed in some way personally, and those kinds of things. The responses are quite different. Go ahead, Kent.
It's interesting. Jesus would teach these things now because within 3 years, he'd be the very embodiment of the very things he's talking about now.
Yeah. The very things that he's trying to encourage his citizens to appreciate and his followers and disciples to appreciate how they should respond to those things is exactly what he will do when it's him on that side of the challenge. Go ahead, Jim.
Is he talking about doing all this stuff in his name against him?
Some of this is suffered because we're connected to him. There's be some suffering and challenges we face because we're connected to him. But I think he's got more of just a personal context here. If people react to us in certain ways, our personal responses to those things are different than the way others would. Verse 30. It says, then give to every man that asketh of thee, and of him that taketh away thy goods, ask them not again. If somebody wants to, what we might simply say, if somebody wants to borrow something, what should they do? Or what should we do? Yeah, let them borrow it. You would know this individual. I don't know whether you've ever heard this story before, but I won't tell you the who, but if you recognize the story, you might remember the who. But I know of a guy who had a neighbor that was notorious for borrowing things, and they never came back in the same shape that they were loaned as. And so if that neighbor would borrow a tool of some type, inevitably it would come back broken, destroyed, if it came back at all. And this fella, it was frustrating, and yet he was still trying to be neighborly. So it didn't matter. No matter how often this guy came, he would still loan him whatever it was he had at his availability to loan him. And his neighbor told him one day, I'm going to be building a deck. And as soon as the guy said, I'm going to be building a deck, this fella knew that he was going to be over there borrowing his saws and everything else he had. Well, he'd been wanting a new saw. So he went out and bought himself a new saw and stuck it in his garage. And when this fella came to borrow the one he knew he was going to, he said, you know what? I knew you were going to need that. I've got two. I don't need two. Here, you can have it. You take the other saw, it's yours. A day later, he had broken that one, was borrowing the new one by the time the thing was over. Now, here's my point. At what point would we have drawn the line? Right? Would it be 2 screwdrivers? Would it be a box of nails? Would it be a broken? At what point would we draw the line and say, I'm not helping that guy anymore. I'm not loaning anything else to that fella anymore. And I appreciated the disposition of this individual who it wasn't as though he had great wealth that he could just be giving saws away. But it was more important to him to be neighborly than it was to worry about a broken tool. And I always felt like that was a great impression. Obviously, I'm still telling this. I've told that story to dozens of audiences because it reminds me of what Jesus is trying to encourage us to appreciate here. If somebody needs something and I can provide it, and then why not do that? Even if it means giving up some of my goods along the way. That's the way we're going to be. And by the way, Jesus is teaching these things prior to his death, burial, and resurrection. He's teaching these things prior to the church coming into fruition and the kingdom being ushered in after his death, burial, and resurrection. Once those New Testament Christians began to be obedient to the gospel and became New Testament Christians, what did they do? In those early chapters of the book of Acts, yeah, right. They learned what Jesus was teaching here. They had all things in common. No one felt like their possessions were just for their own sole purposes. They would sell what they had in order to help others. Jesus was planting the seed of how his early church would survive and function in those early days before it ever came to be. They had the disposition of what was going to take to be followers of Jesus, and it was going to have this giving spirit towards one another. And ultimately, what's the overlying, if you will, principle? And I think it's found in verse 31. As you would what? Yeah, as you would have, or that men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise. That's the overwhelming principle that's guiding all of these things. You would want people to be respectful towards you. You would want them to help you if you needed assistance. You would want those kinds of things to be afforded to you. And the ultimate principle that's under discussion here is this idea of whatever men you would desire for those to do for you or towards you, then do that likewise towards others. Yeah, I think what he means by that is that you don't loan or in some senses give away something and then expect something in return. I think that's what he's talking about. I think that he's talking about that idea of no expectation of return. We're willing to give even when we know that the minute we do, no matter, I ran into a guy one time and he needed help and he was vehement. He's like, give me your address and I will send this back to you. And I was, right, it was like, no, it's unnecessary. We don't give with the intent of always having to receive it back. And I think that's the disposition he's talking about here. Now, certainly it's the right thing if I borrow something to return it, in good shape. It'd be the responsible thing for me to be accountable on my side of that equation. If I'm the borrower, then there are other principles that would guide that. But he's talking about the giver in this circumstance. And when the giver offers something or somebody takes from him something of value, then the giver shouldn't be sitting back waiting for that to be returned unto him, especially returned to him plus. That would not be the disposition Jesus would want us to have. Good question. And then he adds another principle, verse 32. He said, for if you love them which love you, What thank have ye? For sinners also love those that love them. So if you only love those who return it, then he equates you to what? Or me to what? Yeah. He basically says, how's that made you any different? If you return love to everybody who expresses love towards you, how does that make you any different than the world? And Jesus, the answer is it doesn't. Jesus' disciples are different than the world. We behave and act and think and choose differently than the world chooses. And certainly how we entreat one another is completely different than the world would. And so he says, if you love those who love you back, the sinners do that. The world can do that. We're going to be different, Jesus says. And even those who don't do good unto us, even those who mistreat us, even those who don't demonstrate the kind of love and respect they should towards us, we're still going to do good in return. If you do good, verse 33, to them which do good to you, what thank have ye? For sinners what? Do the same. We're not any better than the world if we just follow the world's standard of loving those who love us, doing good to those who do good to us. That doesn't make us the kind of people God would have us to be. Go ahead, Bob. Well, there's nobody in the church yet because it doesn't exist yet. And so I think he's talking about the world. The generic Gentile world, if you will, the Jewish sinner for that matter, but just the world in general will love those who love them. But when you come into my kingdom, it's going to be different. We even love those who hate us. We even do good to those who are our enemies. I think it's a very generic term. I don't think he's got any specific audience in mind. Well,
Isn't he talking to his disciples now?
I mean, the followers, or the people who have come to listen to Jesus speak, is his audience. He's got a large audience of a multitude of people that are there as he preaches this Sermon on the Mount. And so when he's talking to that audience, he says to this audience of people in front of him, if you love those who love you back, you haven't done anything that the world would not do. You haven't done anything that sinners wouldn't do themselves. If you do good to those who do good in return to you, you haven't done something that's any better than the world or sinners would do. Because they would do that. The sinners would do good to those who do good to them. The sinners would love those who love them back. I need you to do better than that. I need you to do good to those who won't return it. And I'm just trying to follow. I don't know that he's got, I don't know, and I'm just trying to follow you, Bob, a little bit here, but he's talking to his audience, and he tells that audience, if you love only those that love you back, you're like the sinners. You're just like the sinners, because that's what they would do. If you only do good to those who do good to you back, you're just like the sinners, because that's what they would do. Yeah, I think Jesus is basically telling that audience that they're not any different than No. So let me backpedal you. He is telling them what the new citizenry will look like when his kingdom comes into existence. He's telling this audience of people, if you're going to be my disciples, you're going to have to rethink the way you think about certain things. You're going to have to rethink about how you respond to people that hate you. You're going to have to rethink about how you respond to those who do good to you or won't do good to you even though you've done good to them. You're going to have to rethink about how you love even when you're hated in return. He's talking about to his followers of the moment who will hopefully become citizens of his kingdom when it comes into fruition and ultimately be long-term followers of his. Yeah, I mean that's fair. I mean it would be anyone who doesn't faithfully follow what God would desire of them. And that's I think that would be a fair description. But I really don't know that, anyway, I think he's just trying to do a comparison here. He's just trying, not necessarily a comparison of groups, so much as this is the way the world generally acts, not so in my kingdom. This is the way they generally behave, not so in my kingdom. And I think that's all he's really driving at. Right, and there are some connotations here maybe as it relates to some of those Old Testament law that will be slightly different. And some of that question will come up in narratives about we still honor some of those kinds of things. And so there may be some of that here. But I guess I just looked at it pretty simple as it relates to those things. But yeah, he definitely is trying to get them to rethink how they behave when they're despised, when they're rejected, when they're hurt, when they're harmed, when they're taken advantage of, when they're insulted, whatever it might be. He's just trying to turn the way they think about how they respond to those things and not act like the sinners, the world, when those things happen. Yeah. And keep in mind, I mean, so when you hear the word sinner, hopefully your mind goes, well, I don't want to be that, right? I don't want to be that. And that's what Jesus is doing here. I don't want to be classified as a sinner. And if the sinners only love those who love them back, I don't want to be that way. I want to be better than that. I want to extend better than that. If the sinners only do good to those who do good, well, I want to be better than a sinner. I don't want to be classified as that. I think that's what he's driving at. He does it again here, by the way, in verse 34. He says, if you lend to them of whom you hope to receive, if you're willing to loan because you think you'll get it back maybe plus some, what good is that? For even the sinners would lend to sinners to receive as much again, but love your enemies instead, and do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again. And your reward shall be great, and ye shall be the children of the highest, for he is kind unto the unthankful and to the evil. And so, Jesus is trying to encourage them to realize that the genuine reward is not because somebody paid you back. The genuine reward isn't that somebody loved you in return. The reward is the fact that God looks at your conduct and your behaviors and your choices and your willingness to behave differently than the world, and He's the rewarder of that. He elevates your service. He looks upon your acts of kindness differently. Not because you receive something personally in return from the world, but because God values those who are willing to love when they're not loved, do good when they don't receive it back, lend when they know they are never going to see that in return. That's the kind of thing God's looking for from the followers of Jesus. And ultimately, those who will be merciful, as your Father also is merciful. And that gets us what somebody mentioned a moment ago. We're talking about adopting the attitudes of Jesus rather than the world. Adopt the attitudes of what Jesus would do in the very similar kinds of circumstance rather than that of the world. Be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. Learn and follow the examples of Jesus, the Savior, and your Creator. thoughts or comments about that context? And really, verses 27 through 37 there, or 36, are really one big thought. It's really just one big thought of how it is that we make choices and decisions different than the world does. Go ahead, Randy.
I think a lot of this is that Jesus preparing them when they go out in the world, because to bring people to Christ, you have to be a different type of person. The people before wasn't going to bring it by doing this,
Yeah.
that, favors, and all that stuff. It's to be over and above that, go out there and show them what Christ really was.
Yeah, and Jesus will say things like that, right? Jesus will say, "Except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, you won't see the kingdom." And there's that kind of language throughout the New Testament when Jesus is teaching folks to reevaluate their standard and what standard they're going to be measured by. And that's particularly true. And by the way, we talk about this multitude that's been following him around as he's traversing around Galilee in these areas, but it is a Jewish audience, right? That's who these people are for the most part. And so they've been trained differently. You go back and read through some of those Old Testament texts and see the kind of mistaken approaches towards what they valued and what they undervalued, and how they treated one another. And you begin to appreciate why Jesus would want to talk about these things and say, listen, we're going to be different. And we're not going to act like we did under the priestly guidance, as poor as it was. We're not going to behave like we once did under that old system that had been manipulated and changed by your leadership. You're going to have to think differently about those things and appreciate the change that's happening when you come into the kingdom of Jesus.
Learn to be humble.
Yeah, and humility would be required for all of those things in that text. Good.
I think when the Bible talks, we're called to peace.
Yeah.
To be people of peace. And I think all of those things, those behaviors, those reactions to other things, I think they're all de-escalating.
Yeah.
And I think it'll create a more peaceful environment in the long run anyway.
Sure. All of these things would help us make for peace in challenging circumstances. And it goes to what Jesus, for as much as within me, live peaceably with all men. And this kind of disposition will lend me to that and lead me to that. That's a good thought. There was mercy, if you will, built inside of that Old Testament system. They just chose to ignore it. They didn't always follow in the very structure that God had presented to them. And that's why I say the Pharisees and the scribes and the priesthood in a lot of ways and the chief rulers among them had not led the people to understand and follow the genuineness of what God had outlined for them under that Mosaic law. And so Jesus is trying to reprogram their thinking about how it is they should behave and how mercy should be extended and those kinds of things.
Does Jesus expect us to love if we're repeatedly abused by someone?
And abuse is a hard definition sometimes, but all I can say is this, is Jesus hanging on a cross after he had been abused more than any of us could ever imagine, and he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. If that's not love, then right? And so, again, I think we can mistake the idea of love and pray for and bless and not curse. We can confuse that for sit there and continue to be taken advantage of. That's not Jesus' intent here at all. Jesus is not teaching a principle. I don't believe that Jesus is teaching a principle here that you just have to sit there and take anything and everything somebody's dishing out, and you just you're free to leave that situation. You know what I mean? And again, we're talking so generically here right now. I'm not, we're not talking about any specific circumstance, but Jesus is not giving us the impression here that love means we allow people to harm and hurt and cause challenge for us. Jesus is saying, if they do, how are you going to respond? If somebody slaps you across the face, how are you going to respond to that? Are you going to seek your own personal retribution? Or are you going to fight fire with fire? If somebody insults you, if somebody, takes your coat from you, how are you personally going to respond to that moment? Is what seems to be the teaching of what Jesus is doing here, not the idea that Jesus is saying sit there and let somebody. I mean, Paul escaped on several occasions when his life was being threatened and people were attacking him and challenging him. Even for the cause of Christ, he found ways to escape. Jesus, when his life was threatened at times when it wasn't the fulfillment of time for him to be crucified, found ways to navigate and escape certain scenes. And so I think there's plenty of evidence within Scripture that people found ways to remove themselves from dangerous situations and not in breach of what Jesus is teaching in this principle, if that helps answer your question.
They're going to have to change their whole way of life.
Yeah, their whole way of thinking is going to have to be thought of differently, that's for sure.
Jesus told Peter to put away his sword.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's sort of the idea. That could have just escalated that situation to it could have not been.
Sure. And I think Jesus is helping us appreciate that sometimes we can create further problems if we act like the world. And that gets a little bit what Christy was saying. If we act like the world does, we can just add fuel to an already existing challenge, which Peter was almost guilty of doing there. All good thoughts. So verse 37, he says, "Judge not, and ye shall not be judged. Condemn not, and ye shall not be condemned. Forgive, and ye shall be forgiven." It's interesting, slightly different, right? In Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 7, when you look at Matthew's record of this, he says, "Judge not that you what? That you be not judged," right? And then he gives this further description, Matthew does, of righteous judgment and the idea that we shouldn't be judging hypocritically with a beam in our eye and that kind. So Matthew gives a lot more detail. Here he initially just gives us this thought of don't judge, because then you can avoid people making judgments about you. Condemn not, ye shall not be condemned. Forgive, and ye shall be forgiven. And keep, yep, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Forgive, brings back Dad years ago when he preached on forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "Well, I'll forgive you, but I won't forget."
Yeah, I won't forget it. Yeah, and we often do that, and forgiveness isn't extended. Keep reading with me, because I want you. If you notice, he doesn't stop. This is just thought after thought after thought. It's one big sentence. Judge not, and ye shall not be judged. Condemn not, and ye shall not be condemned. Forgive, and ye shall be forgiven. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, and shaken together, and running over, shall men give into your bosom.
People like to use this verse.
Yeah.
You can't judge me for what I do.
Yeah, and
Are we judging them?
and I try to encourage people to realize that the Scriptures are the only thing that have a right to judge anything. And if I share with somebody something that's written in the pages of God's Word, and it's the only thing that has a right to judge anything. And I think that's what judge righteous judgment means. If we're applying the Scriptures to some situation or circumstance, then the Scriptures are what's doing, which in turn means who? God, right? It's God. It's His Word. That's right. If I tell somebody what they're doing is wrong out of my own thought processes and opinions, then that's the very thing Jesus is telling us not to do. There's a difference between me making a personal judgment about somebody and applying the standard of God's Word to a situation. And that's hard for people to realize, and sometimes people will say, well, you're judging me. And I try to just encourage them to say, okay, was it in the Bible or not? Did the Bible say that or not? And in a sense, I don't want to say force, but I know a better word, but force them to answer that. Did the Bible say that or not? And if their answer is yes, then you say, then deal with it how, do what you're going to do, but you've admitted that the Bible said that, not me. And then if they say the Bible didn't, then when it's right there and everybody can read it, then now you're dealing with somebody dishonest, and where are you going to go from there anyway, right, Jim? So I think there's some caution here, but lest we make the mistake of, and I think sometimes we do this, we look at Matthew 7's record and we look at Luke 6's record, and because some people abuse the passage in one way by saying, you can't ever judge anything. You're not allowed to judge anything. I'm allowed to do whatever in the world I want, and you have to like it, right? And there's that extreme. And then sometimes we go to the other extreme and almost make these texts out to mean nothing, when that's not true either. There's an important principle that Jesus is trying to get us to appreciate here, and that is, I'm not permitted to apply my personal standards to anybody else's life or choices or decisions. And the minute I start down that road, then don't be shocked when it what? It comes right back. When it comes right back. When I start trying to force people to take the same personal judgments that I do, then don't be shocked when they just bring that right back at me and say, well, no, I want you to live the... We've got to avoid. Don't condemn, and then you won't have that finger coming back at you. Forgive, and forgiveness will be returned to you. And so these are all principles that we need to appreciate. Randy, that bell may not ring. I think the battery may not have caught that up when the power went out. If you go down and tell the classes we're good, thank you.
Well, if you just don't stop there, if you look at the end of verse 38, it tells you it winds all of it back together.
Yeah.
Whatever judgment you use, whatever measurement you use, that's what's going to be used on you.
Yep.
John 12:48, I think Jesus makes it very clear. It said, he that rejecteth me receiveth not my words, hath one that judgeth him. The word that I have spoken, the same shall judge him in the last day.
Yeah, it's the word that brings the judgment. That's absolutely true. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah, I don't have any personal rights to leave certain things in the hands of the God who has the right to do those things. I would agree with that. Any other thoughts or questions? Appreciate all that. Was confident I could have gotten further tonight, but I told you I'm 3 weeks rusty, so maybe we'll get a little further down the road, Lord willing, next week.